The empath sits in a crowded room filled with laughter, overlapping conversations, and the comforting illusion that everyone present is relaxed and enjoying themselves. Yet inside that same space, they are aware of something no one else seems to notice. They sense the quiet fracture beneath the surface. They feel the subtle emotional currents moving invisibly between people like underground rivers. While others hear stories and jokes, the empath perceives tension, concealed sadness, unspoken fear. They watch the woman across the table smile politely while something inside her is already collapsing. They listen to the man telling the loudest story in the room and feel the performance behind his confidence, a nervous attempt to outrun his own silence. They glance at the couple sitting close together in the corner and somehow know, with unsettling clarity, that this connection is already dissolving beneath its appearance of stability. The most disorienting part is not what they perceive. It is the impossibility of explaining how they know it. There is no logical chain of reasoning, no obvious behavioral clue, no concrete evidence they could point to if questioned. The knowledge simply arrives, whole and immediate, like a sudden change in air pressure before a storm. For decades, Carl Jung encountered individuals who described experiences exactly like this. People who sensed psychological truths others could not detect. People who felt emotional atmospheres as tangibly as physical temperature. In a time when the psychiatric world was inclined to categorize unusual perception as pathology, Jung chose a different path. He did not dismiss these individuals as overly sensitive or psychologically unstable. Instead, he began to observe them with rigorous curiosity. What he discovered challenged conventional assumptions about human awareness. These individuals were not imagining their perceptions, nor were they merely reacting to social cues with exaggerated intensity. Jung concluded that certain people possessed an expanded psychological aperture, a mode of consciousness capable of registering subtleties in emotional and unconscious reality that remain invisible to most. He described these capacities as spiritual gifts, not in a mystical or supernatural sense, but as functions operating at the deepest levels of psyche and inner perception. Yet nearly every empath Jung studied shared the same painful confusion. They experienced the consequences of these heightened abilities without understanding their origin. They felt exhausted in social environments without knowing why. They absorbed emotional disturbances that did not belong to them and assumed their own mental stability was failing. They moved through life with a persistent sense of being fundamentally different, as though they had been given an instrument of perception without any instruction manual. In this exploration, we will examine the specific forms these empathic gifts take, according to Jung's observations. We will look at how they function psychologically, why they are so often misunderstood, and what becomes possible when awareness replaces confusion. Because for the empath, understanding their perception does not diminish its intensity, but it can transform chaos into clarity and burden into direction. Jung's systematic exploration of empathic perception did not begin as an abstract philosophical interest. It emerged organically through years of clinical practice. Again and again, patients described experiences that defied neat psychological categorization. They spoke about knowing things regarding strangers that later proved accurate. They described sensing emotional shifts in a room long before anyone else noticed them. Some even reported feeling physical distress in the presence of individuals whose hidden crises or internal conflicts had not yet surfaced into conscious awareness. Where others saw exaggeration or projection, Jung saw a pattern. Rather than dismissing these accounts, he began documenting them carefully. Over time, a constellation of recurring perceptual capacities became evident. These capacities were not random anomalies. They appeared consistently in individuals with a particular form of psychological sensitivity, what we now commonly call empathic wiring. The first of these capacities Jung identified could be described as emotional clairvoyance. This was not a matter of heightened observation or refined social intelligence. Most attentive individuals can interpret body language or detect subtle tonal shifts in conversation. Emotional clairvoyance operated at a deeper level. It involved perceiving the authentic emotional state of another person, even when that state was being skillfully concealed from everyone else present, sometimes even from the person experiencing it. Jung observed that empaths with this ability could participate in group interactions and later describe the concealed grief, rage, or shame carried by individuals who outwardly appeared composed. Their perception functioned less like inference and more like direct sensory recognition. To them, the hidden emotional reality of another person was as self-evident as the color of a garment or the sound of a voice. Tracing the developmental roots of this gift, Jung frequently encountered similar childhood environments among empaths who possessed it. Many had grown up in households where emotional truth was chronically denied or distorted. Parents insisted everything was stable while tension permeated the atmosphere. Families maintained outward normalcy while unresolved conflict quietly eroded psychological safety beneath the surface. In such contexts, a child's survival often depended on perceiving the genuine emotional landscape rather than relying on spoken assurances. Over time, the nervous system adapted. Sensitivity to unspoken emotional signals intensified into a sophisticated perceptual mechanism. By adulthood, this mechanism operated automatically, scanning relational environments continuously. The tragedy Jung noted was that most empaths interpreted this accurate perception as personal emotional instability. They felt overwhelmed by moods that did not originate within them and assumed they were psychologically fragile rather than perceptually attuned. Closely related yet distinct was a second capacity Jung termed pattern prophecy. This ability extended empathic perception beyond present emotional states into the unfolding trajectory of psychological patterns. Individuals with this gift could encounter someone briefly and intuitively grasp the underlying structure of that person's behavioral tendencies. From this recognition emerged a strikingly accurate sense of how certain relational or professional situations were likely to evolve. An empath might meet a friend's new romantic partner and sense, without tangible evidence, that the relationship would eventually become destructive. They might enter a workplace and perceive latent dynamics that would later erupt into conflict. Jung described this phenomenon not as supernatural foresight, but as profound perception of present psychological architecture. When unconscious motivations, defense mechanisms, and unresolved wounds are perceived with sufficient clarity, future outcomes often follow predictable pathways. This form of perception carried a heavy emotional cost. Empaths frequently experienced the anguish of witnessing preventable suffering unfold in what felt like slow motion. Attempts to warn others were commonly dismissed as pessimism or anxiety because their insights were not grounded in observable facts. Only after predicted patterns materialized did others recognize the accuracy of what the empath had sensed. Jung emphasized that pattern prophecy was not intended as a tool for controlling or rescuing others. Its psychological purpose lay in personal navigation. When empaths learn to apply this perception to their own decisions, choosing relationships, environments, and commitments with discernment, their lives often appeared remarkably fortunate from the outside. What observers interpreted as luck was, in Jung's view, the result of acting in alignment with deeper perceptual awareness. A third capacity Jung identified was somatic translation, the process through which emotional or psychological information is experienced as physical sensation. Empaths with this gift might develop headaches in proximity to suppressed anger, nausea in the presence of deception, or constriction in the chest when encountering unprocessed grief. Their bodies functioned as finely tuned instruments, converting intangible psychological signals into tangible physiological experiences. Because modern medical frameworks prioritize purely biological explanations for physical symptoms, individuals with somatic translation often spend years seeking diagnoses that never fully accounted for their experiences. Jung noted that the sensations themselves were real and sometimes intense. What differed was their origin. Rather than arising from internal pathology, they reflected the nervous system's heightened responsiveness to emotional environments. Developmentally, Jung linked this capacity to early stages of human psychological growth. Infants and young children process relational dynamics primarily through bodily sensation before language and conceptual thought are fully established. While most individuals gradually shift toward more cognitive forms of emotional processing, empaths tend to retain and refine this somatic channel. Their perception remains embodied, allowing them to register subtle emotional data long after others have ceased noticing such signals consciously. When understood and integrated, somatic translation could function as an extraordinary navigational resource. Persistent physical discomfort in certain relational contexts might serve as an early indicator of psychological incongruence or hidden threat. Conversely, sensations of ease and openness could signal environments conducive to authentic connection and growth. Jung observed that empaths who learned to interpret these bodily messages with discernment gained an almost instinctive ability to orient themselves wisely within complex social landscapes. These first three gifts, emotional clairvoyance, pattern prophecy, and somatic translation, illustrate how empathic perception operates across multiple channels simultaneously. Each reflects an expanded sensitivity to dimensions of human experience that typically remain outside conscious awareness. Yet for those who possess such sensitivity, the challenge lies not merely in perceiving more, but in learning how to live sustainably with what is perceived. Jung's work suggested that empathic gifts are not anomalies to be corrected, nor advantages to be romanticized. They are aspects of psychological architecture requiring conscious relationship and skillful integration. Without understanding, they generate confusion and exhaustion. With awareness, they can become instruments of clarity, guiding individuals toward environments and relationships aligned with deeper psychological truth. As Jung continued his observations, further dimensions of empathic perception emerged, revealing an even broader spectrum of sensitivity than previously recognized. These additional capacities deepened his conviction that the empathic psyche represents a distinct mode of experiencing reality, one that challenges conventional assumptions about the limits of human awareness. As Jung's investigation progressed, he began to notice that empathic perception extended beyond individual emotional signals and behavioral trajectories into something more diffuse and collective. Certain individuals demonstrated an ability to sense the psychological climate of entire environments almost instantaneously. Jung eventually described this capacity as psychic atmosphere perception, a heightened sensitivity to the emotional and unconscious residues that accumulate within shared spaces. Empaths with this gift would enter a room and feel the prevailing relational dynamics before any interaction took place. A home might appear warm and aesthetically inviting, yet register internally as tense or suffocating. A workplace might present an image of collaboration while emanating an undercurrent of rivalry and mistrust. Conversely, even the simplest environment, a quiet park bench or modest gathering space, could evoke a sense of safety or quiet sacredness that defied logical explanation. Jung connected this perceptual phenomenon to his theory of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath personal psychological experience lies a shared psychic field shaped by archetypal patterns and accumulated emotional history. While most individuals experience this field only as vague impressions or fleeting moods, empaths often perceive it with striking clarity. Their awareness functions almost like an internal barometer, registering subtle shifts in collective emotional pressure. This ability frequently led empaths into an unconscious behavioral pattern Jung found both admirable and problematic. Sensing tension or psychological toxicity in an environment, they would instinctively attempt to regulate or harmonize the atmosphere. They might introduce humor into strained interactions, offer quiet reassurance in chaotic situations, or absorb emotional distress in order to make a space more tolerable for others. Although such interventions could temporarily restore equilibrium, they often left the empath depleted, having performed invisible psychological labor that went largely unrecognized. Jung was careful to emphasize that the essential function of this gift was perception, not responsibility. Feeling the emotional climate of a space did not obligate the empath to correct or carry it. Sustainable integration required developing the discernment to observe without automatically intervening. When empaths learn to honor their sensitivity without sacrificing their vitality, atmosphere perception could become a sophisticated navigational tool rather than a source of chronic exhaustion. Another dimension Jung documented with remarkable consistency was what he termed shadow magnetism. This referred to the tendency for empaths to attract individuals burdened by unresolved psychological material, repressed anger, denied grief, unacknowledged shame, or deeply embedded insecurity. Jung interpreted this pattern through the lens of his concept of the shadow, the collection of disowned aspects of the psyche that seek recognition and integration. He proposed that the unconscious mind, driven by a fundamental impulse toward wholeness, gravitates toward those capable of perceiving what has been hidden. Empaths, with their capacity to detect subtle emotional undercurrents, often function as unwitting catalysts for this process. Individuals carrying heavy psychological burdens may feel an inexplicable pull toward them, sensing without conscious awareness the possibility of being seen or understood. This dynamic can manifest in recurring relational patterns. Empaths may find themselves repeatedly entering friendships or partnerships in which they assume the role of witness, confidant, or emotional stabilizer. Initially, such connections can feel meaningful or even destined, as the depth of sharing creates rapid intimacy. Over time, however, the empath may become overwhelmed by the cumulative weight of holding experiences that were never truly theirs to process. Jung observed that without conscious boundaries, shadow magnetism could lead to cycles of burnout, disillusionment, and self-doubt. Transformation, in Jung's view, did not involve eliminating this magnetic quality. It was embedded in the empathic psyche structure. Instead, growth required recognizing the pattern and responding with deliberate choice rather than reflexive caretaking. When empaths learned to differentiate between genuine mutual growth and unconscious dependency, shadow magnetism could shift from a source of vulnerability into a diagnostic signal, indicating where deep psychological work was seeking a container and whether they were truly meant to provide it. A further capacity Jung identified was temporal emotional sensitivity, the perception of emotional residues extending beyond the immediate present moment. Some empaths reported encountering intense feelings when interacting with objects, locations, or individuals whose histories were unknown to them. They might experience unexplained sorrow while holding an heirloom, a sense of dread in historically significant sites, or waves of unease in newly occupied living spaces. Jung approached this phenomenon with characteristic caution. He resisted both dismissing such experiences as mere fantasy and inflating them into supernatural claims. Instead, he framed temporal emotional sensitivity as a potential extension of empathic attunement to psychological imprints that linger within environments and relational fields. Whether these impressions operated through subtle physiological cues, archetypal resonance within the collective unconscious, or mechanisms yet to be scientifically articulated, remained an open question. What Jung found most compelling was the consistency of these reports and their occasional verifiability through later information. For those who possessed this sensitivity, the challenge again lay in integration. Without understanding, such experiences could contribute to feelings of alienation or confusion. With reflection and grounding, they could enrich an individual's appreciation of psychological continuity, the way human emotion leaves traces that shape perception across time. Jung believed that acknowledging these subtle layers of experience encouraged humility and responsibility in how individuals engage with their surroundings. When considered together, these additional gifts, atmosphere, perception, shadow, magnetism, and temporal emotional sensitivity, reveal empathic awareness as a multidimensional phenomenon. It is not confined to reading individual emotions or predicting interpersonal patterns. It encompasses a broader sensitivity to collective processes, unconscious attraction dynamics, and the lingering influence of emotional history. Underlying all these expressions, Jung identified a single organizing principle. The empathic psyche operates with a wider aperture of consciousness. Just as a camera lens with a larger opening admits more light and detail, empathic awareness receives a greater volume and complexity of psychological information. This expanded intake can illuminate nuances of human experience that remain obscure to narrower modes of perception. At the same time, it exposes the empath to increased intensity, more beauty and more suffering, more authenticity and more illusion. Because this perceptual openness lacks an intrinsic filter, empaths often feel inundated by contradictory signals. They may register hidden tenderness alongside concealed hostility, collective grief alongside emerging hope. Jung noted that without conscious interpretation, such simultaneous awareness can generate emotional overload. The task of development, therefore, involves cultivating an inner framework capable of organizing and contextualizing the constant influx of data. He emphasized that empathic gifts were not meant to be suppressed or exaggerated. Attempts to dull sensitivity frequently resulted in psychosomatic distress or depressive withdrawal, while romanticizing these abilities risked detachment from grounded psychological reality. The path Jung advocated centered on relationship learning, to engage with one's perception as a partner rather than an adversary. This relational stance required recognizing which gift was active in a given moment, understanding its informational value, and deciding intentionally how to respond. Over time, empaths who practiced this form of conscious engagement often experienced a profound shift. They retained their perceptual depth, yet no longer felt submerged by it. Instead of reacting reflexively to every emotional signal, they developed the capacity to observe, reflect, and choose their level of involvement. Such integration did not transform empaths into emotionally distant observers. Rather, it allowed them to participate in human connection with greater clarity and resilience. Their sensitivity became less like an uncontrolled flood and more like a navigable current, guiding them toward environments and relationships aligned with their authentic psychological direction. Jung regarded this transformation as a significant milestone in individuation, the lifelong process of integrating unconscious material into conscious awareness. For empaths, individuation involved not only confronting personal shadow elements, but also understanding the unique perceptual architecture through which they encountered the world. By embracing this architecture with discernment, they could move from feeling defined by their differences to recognizing those differences as integral components of their psychological strength. What ultimately unified all of Jung's observations about empathic perception was the recognition that these gifts were not separate anomalies, but varied expressions of a single underlying difference in consciousness. Emotional clairvoyance, pattern prophecy, somatic translation, atmosphere perception, shadow magnetism, and temporal emotional sensitivity all emerged from the same expanded psychological aperture. The empath did not merely feel more intensely, they perceived more dimensions of reality at once. This wider perceptual field explained both the profound insight and the profound exhaustion commonly reported by empaths. To register hidden grief alongside visible joy, unconscious hostility beneath polite interaction, or lingering emotional residues embedded in space and memory is to live within a richer yet more demanding psychological landscape. Jung emphasized that this condition was neither a flaw to be corrected nor a mystical status to be idolized. It was a structural feature of the empathic psyche, requiring understanding, responsibility, and conscious participation. Without such awareness, empathic gifts tend to operate chaotically. Sensations are misinterpreted as personal instability. Accurate perception is dismissed as anxiety or pessimism. Relational magnetism draws individuals into cycles of emotional overextension. The result is a life marked by confusion and depletion, accompanied by the persistent belief that something essential is wrong within. Jung encountered this pattern repeatedly in those who had never been given language for their experiences. The turning point he described was deceptively simple: recognition. When empaths began to identify the specific channels through which their perception functioned, the meaning of their lifelong struggles shifted. Exhaustion became evidence of overexposure rather than weakness. Emotional overwhelm became intelligible as unfiltered data rather than internal dysfunction. The sense of alienation that had followed them since childhood began to soften as they realized their difference was not imaginary but rooted in a distinct psychological configuration. Jung did not propose a formula for mastering empathic gifts. He understood that each individual's relationship with perception unfolds uniquely. Instead, he offered a framework, a conceptual map that allowed empaths to orient themselves within their own inner terrain. Through this framework, sensitivity could gradually be transformed from an involuntary burden into a deliberate instrument of navigation. Empaths who achieved this conscious relationship often appeared to undergo a subtle yet unmistakable transformation. They still sensed the emotional temperature of a room, but no longer felt compelled to absorb or regulate it automatically. They could recognize shadow material in others without assuming responsibility for its integration. They could anticipate psychological trajectories and quietly adjust their own course rather than attempting to redirect the destinies of those around them. In Jung's view, this evolution represented a form of psychological empowerment distinct from conventional notions of power. It was not about influence or control. It was about clarity, the capacity to perceive reality beneath social performance, to discern authentic connection from unconscious entanglement, and to move through life guided by an inner compass attuned to subtle truth. If you recognize these patterns within your own experience, if you have sensed emotions others overlook, felt information resonate through your body, or navigated environments according to impressions you could not fully explain, Jung would suggest that you are not confronting a defect. You are encountering the responsibilities and possibilities of expanded perception. The exhaustion and confusion you have known were never proof of inadequacy. They were signals that your awareness had been operating without context. Understanding does not silence empathic gifts. It gives them direction. It allows sensitivity to coexist with stability, depth with discernment, openness with intentional boundaries. And in that integration, what once felt like a lifelong mystery can begin to reveal itself as a coherent and meaningful aspect of who you are becoming.